that can hit the counter before the words did. Hard plastic on hard laminate. A sound that cut through the hum of fluorescent lights and the low, exhausted cry of a baby pressed against a red hoodie. Every head in aisle 7 turned. Not because of the sound, because of what came after it. "Sir." The store manager's voice had that particular flatness, the kind that wasn't really talking to you but performing for the room. "I said, we cannot take this back without the original packaging insert." Zaire Mosswood didn't flinch. He stood with his baby boy, Tobias, tucked in the crook of his left arm and his white cane folded against his right hand. His dark glasses caught the overhead light. His jaw was set in the way of a man who had already decided this conversation would not break him. Not because it wasn't painful, but because he had survived too many just like it to give this one any more than it deserved. He had been in this store 43 times. He knew by scent where the formula aisle was. He knew by sound when the cashier lines were short. He knew by the particular draft from the east corner where the coolers needed repair. He knew this building the way you know a place you have had to learn without anyone's help. Completely quietly, without any margin for error. And he knew already that the manager hadn't moved from behind the counter because people like him, blind omegas with discount brand formula and a baby who hadn't stopped wheezing since Tuesday, weren't worth the energy of a full confrontation. Just enough to humiliate, not enough to actually engage. "The insert was inside the can," Zaire said. His voice was even, not loud, not shaking, even. "When I opened it, that is where it was. Well, we need it to be separate. Then someone should have told me that when I bought it." "Sir, that's standard." "Who's standard?" Pause. Long pause. The kind that answered nothing and said everything. Hi viewers, have you ever been standing in a public place where someone treated you like you were invisible, and not one single person around you said a word? Drop a yes or a no in the comments right now, because what happens next in this store is going to shake you to your core. Tobias whimpered. A thin, wet sound against the collar of Zaire's hoodie. The baby had been making that sound for 3 days straight. Not a full cry, a tired one. The kind that comes from a small body that has been working too hard just to stay comfortable and is starting to lose the argument. Zaire bounced him once, twice, 3 times, the automatic rhythm of a man who had learned his baby's distress signals the way other people learn traffic patterns. His thumb pressed flat against the baby's back to feel the rise and fall. Still shallow. Still wrong. Something in his chest tightened. He kept his face still. "People like you," the manager said. And he said it quietly enough that he could deny it later, just under the ambient noise of the store, just inside the radius of people who might hear but not quite clearly enough to quote. "Need to keep better track of things." Nobody moved. 6 people in that checkout area. 2 teenagers in the express lane, both on their phones. A woman with a full grocery cart who had been watching since the can hit the counter. A couple near the magazine rack who had taken a small step backward. One older man in a postal uniform who met Zaire's direction for half a second and then looked away. Not one of them spoke. Some looked at the floor. Some at their phones. One of them, the woman with the cart, raised her phone slowly, like she was considering recording something. Then she thought better of it. Put it back in her purse. Looked somewhere else. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Powdered milk. Plastic. The cold, metallic smell of a refrigeration unit running hard. These were the things Zaire was aware of. These and the weight of Tobias against his chest. These and the fact that the wheezing had gotten slightly worse in the last 4 minutes. What none of them noticed, because they were all watching Zaire, waiting to see what a blind omega with a sick baby would do when backed into a corner, was the temperature shift. It was small. A draft that came from the east entrance and didn't correspond with the automatic doors opening. A scent carried on it. Cedar. Iron. Something underneath both of those things, like rain hitting warm concrete. Distinctive. Unmistakable to anyone who had ever been close to it. 3 sources. Identical. The triplets had been inside the store for 11 minutes. They had not entered together, that was habit, not arrangement. Selim through the east entrance, moving slowly along the outer wall. Damon through the pharmacy side, stopping once near the vitamin display. Rashid through the back near the loading dock where he knew a stockroom manager owed him a conversation about a separate matter entirely. They had not planned to converge in aisle 7. But they had. And now they stood, not clustered, not announcing themselves, not doing anything that would register as a group, in 3 separate positions with the same sightline. Watching. Selim was the closest. Close enough to hear Tobias's breathing over the ambient noise of the store. Close enough to read the small print on the returned formula can without moving. He read the batch number once. Then again. His jaw locked. Something behind his eyes went very still. Rashid, positioned 2 aisles over near a display of canned goods, caught his brother's eyes across the space. One look. The kind of look that passes between people who grew up communicating in silence because the rooms they grew up in weren't always safe for words. One look that carried a full sentence. Rashid pulled out his phone. The manager was still talking. A practice speech now, store policy, customer responsibility, the inconvenience of exceptions. The words had a rehearsed quality, like he'd delivered them before and found they worked well enough on people who had nowhere else to escalate. Zaire had stopped responding to him. He picked up the formula can with his free hand. Tobias pressed firmly against his chest. And he turned toward the exit with the particular, exhausted precision of a man who had decided that today, this was the hill he would not die on. Not because it wasn't worth fighting, because his son needed to get home. He moved through the store the way he always moved. Deliberate. Exact. No hesitation, no searching, no wasted motion. The cane touched the floor in a rhythm so practiced it had become part of his breathing. He didn't know 3 sets of eyes tracked every step. He didn't know that one of those men had stopped moving entirely. Just stopped, standing in the middle of the store aisle with a look on his face that had nothing to do with corporate investigation. He didn't know the batch number on that can was supposed to have been pulled from distribution 6 weeks ago. He didn't know that the quiet phone call the manager made from the back office, 30 seconds after he walked out, was not to a supervisor. He just walked out into the gray afternoon, Tobias wheezing softly at his collarbone, the crumpled receipt in his jacket pocket, the cold air hitting his face like a small, brief mercy. He didn't know it yet, but that receipt, that simple, discounted, almost returned receipt, was about to unravel an empire. The black SUV was already at the curb when he came out. He walked past it without knowing. Inside the store, Selim Dree turned to the brother nearest to him. 2 words. Quiet. Certain. Follow him. Selim remembered the smell of chalk dust first. Not a face. Not a voice. Not a specific afternoon. Just chalk dust and the particular quality of silence in a high school library on a Thursday. The kind of silence that only exists when a building is almost empty and the people still inside have chosen to be there, which made it a different kind of quiet than ordinary quiet. Intentional quiet. The silence of people doing real work. Zaire had been at the back table. Not hiding. Not isolated in the way of someone who had been excluded. Just using the space the way you use something nobody else wants, carefully, fully, with complete attention. He had been working through a calculus problem set. Zaire had won a district scholarship that year, the first Omega student at Caldwell Prep to do it in 11 years. The school had put out a press release, held an assembly, then promptly failed to provide him with a single accommodation for his visual impairment, which meant he spent the first 3 months finding workarounds on his own. He was good at workarounds. Selim had come to the library because he was avoiding his brothers. Not out of anger, just the ordinary need for a version of himself that wasn't the oldest Dree triplet, the heir apparent, the one who was supposed to already know what he wanted and how to get it. The library was the one place in the school where his last name didn't precede him. They hadn't talked that first day. Selim had sat at the opposite end of the room and tried to read and mostly watched, out of the corner of his eye, the way Zaire navigated a space that hadn't been designed with him in mind. The way he adapted. The way he never once looked like he was doing anything extraordinary. The second Thursday it happened again. The third Thursday, Zaire said, without looking up from his work, "You're going to be here every week. You might as well sit closer." That had been 16 years ago. Now Selim stood outside a 4-story walk-up on the east end of Caldwell Street in the cold, watching a light come on in a second-floor window, and he felt the weight of those 16 years in a way that had no clean name. Batch number 4471, R. Rashid said beside him, voice low, eyes on his phone screen. Recall notice issued October 3rd. Full distribution pull order sent to 47 retail partners in this region alone. And this store. Rashid didn't answer immediately. That was its own answer. Selim looked at him. The zip code routing on the distribution list, Rashid said. His voice careful and flat the way it got when he was delivering information he didn't want to be the one delivering. Excluded 6 districts. All low income. All on the east and south sides of the city. Selim turned back to the window. Excluded, he said. Not a question. Just making the word real by saying it out loud. Not by oversight. Rashid put the phone in his pocket. Someone built that exclusion into the routing matrix. Someone with system access and a reason. Damon was 20 feet behind them, leaning against the SUV, watching the building with the particular patience of a man who spent most of his professional life waiting for other people to say what he had already calculated. He was the quietest of the 3. People sometimes mistook that for disengagement. It was the opposite. We need to think carefully about how we move, Damon said. We need to move, Selim said. I'm not saying don't move. I'm saying, Damon paused. This routes back through Hendrix Logistics, the acquisition we closed last month. Which means if this becomes public before we understand the full shape of it, everything traces back to us. The recall failure, the distribution gap, the families. We didn't know about the formula manufacturing line when we acquired. Damon looked at him. We didn't ask, he said. That sat in the air between them like something physical. The light in the second-floor window moved. A shape behind the curtain, compact, deliberate. A man learning a space he had probably lived in long enough to know well, moving through it with the efficiency of someone who never needed to turn on more lights than necessary. No extra steps. No pauses for orientation. Just movement, like water finding its path. Then the shape stopped, and the baby started crying. Not the worn-down, tired sound from the store. This was different, higher, startled into it. And then nothing. The cry cut off. Incomplete. Selim was already moving before the silence had time to fully settle. Through the building's front entrance. The door had a busted magnetic lock he'd noted on the way in. Up the stairs, not the elevator. Second floor. Left turn. Third door. He knocked. Hard. 3 times. Nothing. He knocked again and pressed his ear close to the door's surface and heard it. A small, terrible sound. Not a cry. Not the normal protest of an unhappy baby. Something labored. Something working too hard. Rashid was behind him, phone out, already looking up the building manager's number. Selim knocked a 3rd time, palm flat, and said through the door clearly, Zaire, it's open the door. Something is wrong with your son. Open the door right now. 1 beat of silence. 1 full, suspended second. The door opened. Zaire stood in the frame with Tobias in his arms and his face arranged in the expression of a man who had already known, on some level, for several days, and had been holding the knowing at a distance because naming it meant dealing with it, and dealing with it meant he was alone with something he could not manage by himself. Tobias's lips had a grayish cast at the edges. His small chest was working visibly, pulling, struggling. Selim took 1 step forward and held out his arms. Zaire looked at him. Not seeing him, but facing him, reading whatever he could read from sound and scent and the quality of the moment. Then he handed Tobias over. Just like that. No hesitation. No demand for explanation. No questioning of who or why. He handed over his son. And Selim took him and ran. That moment, that specific, unrepeatable moment, was the first real thing that had happened between them in 16 years. Not corporate interest. Not investigation. Not the weight of what their names represented in the city and what those names had cost people like Zaire. Just one man handing his most important thing to another, and the other one running with it toward the nearest emergency entrance. The ER at Caldwell General smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee and the specific kind of fear that settles into fluorescent light and doesn't leave. Selim came through the sliding doors at a pace just under running, because running in an emergency room causes the wrong kind of attention, and the wrong kind of attention makes people slow down to manage the chaos instead of speeding up to solve the problem. He had learned this the hard way in a different emergency room in a different city 12 years ago, and he had never forgotten it. Infant, 9 months old, 3-day history of labored breathing, getting worse, lips showing signs of hypoxia, possible allergic response or contamination exposure. He delivered it to the first nurse, who made eye contact. Flat, precise, no room for clarifying questions he didn't have answers to. They took Tobias. A set of doors closed. Zaire had come in behind him and was now standing in the open space of the waiting area, very still, his head slightly tilted, listening for his son's cry in the direction the nurses had taken him, tracking by the last known sound. There was no cry. Zaire turned toward where Selim's breathing was. "They have him," Selim said. Zaire nodded once. He didn't sit down. He stood near the wall, one hand pressed flat against the painted cinder block beside him, and he breathed in a way that was controlled on the surface and not controlled underneath, and Selim understood without needing it explained that this was what Zaire Mosswood looked like when he was terrified and was not going to show it any more than that. Rashid arrived at the ER 20 minutes later. He had stopped at the car to make 3 phone calls, and his face, when he walked in, had the particular closed quality that meant at least one of those calls had returned information he was not happy with. Damon was still on the phone outside. "Anything yet?" Rashid asked. "Waiting," Selim said. They stood. 45 minutes. Selim counted them by the rhythm of his own pulse before he ever glanced at a clock. The doctor came out. Young, deliberately measured in her movements, with the word selection of someone who had been specifically briefed on being careful. She introduced herself as Dr. Anaya Pulliam. She explained that Tobias had been stabilized. She explained that preliminary tests indicated a chemical contaminant in his system consistent with degraded protein compounds. Not a bacteria, not a virus. Chemical, traceable to a specific manufacturing or storage failure. "Which formula lot?" Rashid asked. She looked at her tablet. "I'm not able to disclose." "Dr. Pulliam," Rashid said. "Which lot?" She looked at him with an expression that held a specific kind of conflict. A person caught between a professional instruction and the knowledge that the instruction was protecting something that had already hurt someone. Selim stepped in front of his brother. "Is he going to be okay?" he said. Not a question. A requirement. She looked at him. "He's stable. We want to keep him overnight, possibly through tomorrow morning. But yes, he's going to be okay." Selim exhaled. Just once. Then he turned and looked at the place in the room where Zaire was standing, and he said it again, quietly, in that direction. "He's going to be okay." Zaire didn't respond for a moment. Then, "I know." He said it the way people say things they have decided to believe because the alternative is not survivable. Damon came through the entrance 40 minutes later. He crossed the waiting room without urgency and took a seat 2 chairs away from Selim and set his phone face down on his knee and looked at neither of his brothers for a full 10 seconds, which was Damon's way of asking for a moment before he had to say a thing he didn't want to say. Selim waited. Hendrix Logistics acquired a formula manufacturing company as part of a subsidiary bundle, Damon said. The acquisition finalized 18 days ago. Before or after the recall notice? 15 days after. Selim closed his eyes. "The compliance reports," he said, "were not in the due diligence packet we reviewed." "Why not?" Damon's jaw moved slightly. "Because someone made sure they weren't," he said. "I haven't confirmed who yet, but the folder structure in the acquisition file shows 3 documents reclassified from active review to archived reviewed 11 days before we signed. Someone with internal access to the deal management platform moved them, changed the timestamp, made them look like they'd been signed off on. The room held the weight of that. There had been a quality audit in August. It had flagged the storage violation. There had been a compliance report that should have triggered a full recall, not a partial one, not a geographically selective one, a full one. There had been an internal memo dated 9 days before the deal closed that referenced. In the careful, evasive language of people who know they are documenting something they don't want documented, liability considerations associated with uneven distribution correction timelines. Someone had read those documents and made a choice. The choice was to hide them. The choice was to let the Dree family sign an acquisition that came with a ticking liability they didn't know existed. And the people in the lowest income zip codes, the people nobody was watching closely enough, were going to be the ones who felt it first. Rashid had positioned himself near the nurse's station at the far end of the waiting area while the others talked. He had a specific ability to be present in a space without registering as present. Useful in negotiations, useful in situations like this one. He heard the intake nurse at the far desk checking in 2 infants from a shelter on the south side. He heard the symptoms listed. He heard the formula brand named. He walked back to his brothers at a normal pace, sat down, and said at a volume just above a whisper, "There are 2 more infants from Marsh Street Shelter being admitted right now. Same presentation. Same time frame." Nobody spoke. "This is not one family," Rashid said. And the silence that followed that sentence was the kind that happens when a problem you thought had edges reveals that it has none. Zaire asked for documentation, not money. Not an apology delivered by a hospital administrator in a pressed shirt. Not the meal voucher or the taxi reimbursement or the family comfort basket the social worker mentioned when she appeared in the doorway of Tobias's recovery room with the careful, trained warmth of someone doing a job they had been told mattered. "I want the contamination report," Zaire said, before she had finished her introduction. "The one filed with the lot number and the chain of custody for the product." She paused. "And the distribution records, which stores received batch 4471, are what dates, what quantities." "Mr. Mosswood, I'm here to talk about support resources and the recall notice. I want the exact date it was issued, the exact method of distribution, and the exact confirmation of delivery to each retail partner in this zip code." She left without giving him any of it. She returned 20 minutes later with a legal affairs representative. A man named Gerald who wore a lanyard with too many badges on it and had clearly been briefed for a different version of this conversation. Gerald talked for 45 seconds about the hospital's commitment to patient families and the availability of the patient advocacy office and the process for formally requesting medical records. Zaire let him finish, then said, "I didn't ask about medical records. I asked about product distribution documentation. Those are different requests governed by different legal frameworks. I'd like to know which one you're actually authorized to respond to." Gerald looked at the social worker. The social worker looked at Gerald. Zaire waited. This was the thing about Zaire that disrupted people's assumptions. Not his blindness, not his status, not even his composure under pressure. It was the precision. The way he moved through a conversation like a man who had done his reading and knew exactly where the exits were. People expected grief and gratitude and the kind of desperation that made you easy to manage. What they got instead was a man who understood that helplessness was usually just the absence of information, and who was very interested in the information. They gave him a chair and a hospital-grade blanket and a cup of coffee from the family waiting room. They did not give him documents. The triplets worked through the night. In the parking structure across the street from the hospital, Damon in the driver's seat of the SUV with his laptop running on a mobile hotspot, the financial audit began. No external firm. No announcement. Internal access codes that had come to the 3 brothers in stages over the past several years as their father transferred pieces of operational authority to each of them in the way of a man who was not sure which son he trusted most and so had distributed the trust strategically, ensuring that none of them had everything alone. Damon traced the acquisition chain backward through 4 subsidiary entities. He found the document reclassification in the deal management platform at 2:37 in the morning, a precise timestamp, logged automatically by the system even when the user thought they were working quietly. The action had been performed from a workstation in the finance division. 3rd floor. A workstation registered to the CFO. In a different parking lot 2 miles away, Rashid sat in a rental car. He never used his own vehicle for this kind of work, with a logistics platform pulled up on a tablet. Distribution records for consumer goods were less protected than financial documents. They lived in operations software that most people with legal access never thought to examine carefully. Rashid had spent 3 years restructuring the port freight operation after their father handed it off in a state of deliberate chaos, and he had learned that software the way you learn a language you didn't choose but ended up needing. The recall notice for batch 4471 had been generated and sent to every retail partner in the network, except 6. The exclusion was not a glitch. It was a field entry in a document called, with almost insulting plainness, the Priority Deprioritization Matrix. The document was 3 pages long. It listed, by zip code, the retail partners that would receive recall notifications on a delayed or excluded basis when internal inventory return costs exceeded a threshold. The threshold was set low enough to trigger in almost every recall scenario involving the east and south sides of the city. The justification given in the document was operational efficiency. Rashid read that phrase 3 times. Operational efficiency. He printed the document using a portable printer he kept in the rental car for situations like this one, and he held the paper in his hands for a moment, and then he put it in a file folder and set it on the passenger seat. Selim found Zaire just before 4 in the morning. Not in Tobias's room. A nurse had asked him to step out for a procedure. He was in the corridor outside, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his legs extended and his head tilted back at an angle that might have looked like resting to anyone who didn't know how to read him. Selim sat down beside him on the floor. The corridor was quiet. Cart rolled somewhere far down the hall. The lights were on their overnight dimming schedule, the fluorescence running at 60%, which cast everything in a slightly muted version of itself. "He's going to be okay," Selim said. "You've said that." "I know." Zaire's head stayed back. His hands were folded on his lap with a careful stillness. "The batch number," he said. "You knew it when you saw it in the store." Selim didn't answer right away. "You were already following me before you knocked on my door." "Yes." Zaire nodded very slowly, processing the architecture of events the way he processed most things, not from the emotional entry point first but from the structural one, mapping the shape of it, understanding the geometry before he let himself feel the weight. Why? Because the recall on that batch was supposed to have reached every retailer in this region 6 weeks ago, and the store you were in was not on the confirmation list. I needed to understand why. Zaire was quiet. "You could have called the store." "I could have." A longer pause. "But you followed me home instead." "Yes." Selim didn't elaborate. There was more to say, and they both knew it, and neither of them was ready to say it in a hospital corridor at 4 in the morning with a sick baby 20 feet away. "Your CFO?" Zaire said. Selim looked at him. "What does he drive?" "A black Audi." "For door." "Why?" Zaire was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "There was a black Audi sedan outside my building 2 nights ago. 11:15, maybe 11:20. Engine running. Parked in a space that doesn't belong to anyone on my floor. I know the sounds of every car that uses those spaces. This one sat for 31 minutes and then left without anyone getting in or out." Selim stared at him. "You counted." "I count things," Zaire said simply. "It's how I know where I am." Selim looked at the far wall of the corridor. At the pale institutional paint, the scuff marks at baseboard height, the small printed signs in English and Spanish pointing toward departments. He stayed very still for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone. He texted Damon 3 words. CFO. Overnight movements. By 6:45 in the morning, Damon had the answer. $4.7 million. Moved through a wire transfer initiated at 11:48 p.m. 2 nights prior. Destination. A Cayman Islands account established 3 days before the transfer. The account had no prior history. It had been created for a single purpose. The CFO had not made a mistake. He had been paid to make one. And whoever had paid him was still out there. They fired him on a Wednesday. The press release went out at 9:02 in the morning. 17 words about leadership transitions and the board's ongoing commitment to operational integrity. Language that had been optimized for the financial press. Language that moved the stock and disclosed nothing. By noon, DRE Holdings was up 2 points. By the end of that week, The legal team had drafted and executed 3 preliminary settlement agreements with families connected to the Omega shelter system. Quiet settlements, structured payouts, non-disclosure language built into every clause, the kind of legal architecture designed to make a problem disappear on paper while the paper itself became the new problem. People in the boardroom exhaled. Someone ordered lunch. Felt like the hard part was over. It wasn't even close. 14 days after the press release, the storage wing of the Marsh Street Omega shelter burned. Not the whole building. That was the detail that mattered. Not the residential floors, not the common areas, not the kitchen. The storage wing. Specifically, the room where donated formula, baby supplies, and medical equipment were kept. The room that served the 43 families currently in residence, 17 of whom had infants under 18 months. The fire marshal's first report cited probable cause as faulty wiring in the east wall junction box. The fire marshal's second report, issued 3 weeks later after a forensic team completed its assessment, cited accelerant. Specifically, a petroleum-based compound applied to the lower wall surface near the storage room's ventilation intake. Someone had said it deliberately. Someone had known exactly which room to burn. Zaire found out from Celestine. She called him at 7:40 in the morning in the flat, careful voice of a woman who had learned to deliver terrible information without letting it collapse her. Because collapsing was a luxury she could not afford when 43 families were depending on her to stay upright. She told him about the fire. She told him about the room. And then she told him something else. Before the fire, she said. About a week before. She had found a case of formula in the back of the storage room. Not donated through their usual channels, just there, tucked behind the larger supply boxes like it had been placed rather than delivered. She had read the batch number because Zaire had told her, after Tobias came home from the hospital, exactly which numbers to watch for. She had set it aside in a separate cabinet. She had not distributed it to any of the families. She had been waiting to figure out what to do with it. The cabinet had been in the storage room. It's gone, Celestine said. Everything in that room is gone. Zaire sat on the edge of his bed. Tobias was asleep in the next room. The baby monitor on the nightstand showed a steady green light. Breathing normal, heart rate normal, the soft rhythmic number that Zaire had learned to read by feel before Tobias even came home because he had spent 2 weeks in the hospital learning every piece of equipment before he let his son be discharged into his soul care. Celestine, he said. Was it just the one room? Just the storage wing, she said. The fire investigator said it was contained fast. Like it wasn't meant to spread. Just destroy that specific area. He sat with that for a moment. Like it knew, she said. Like it knew exactly what to take. He thanked her. He told her he would call her later that day. He ended the call and set the phone down on his knee, and he did not move for 90 seconds. Then he called Selim. 1 ring. 2. The shelter fire, Zaire said when the line opened. I know. Rashid called me an hour ago. Selim's voice was low. He was either in a car or a quiet room. The ambient sound was controlled. There was a case of formula in that storage room. Same batch. Celestine pulled it before it could be distributed. It was sitting in a cabinet, waiting. A pause. How did she know to pull it? I told her what to look for. Another pause. Longer. Selim. Zaire's voice was steady. Someone knew that case was there. Someone knew it was in that specific room in that specific shelter. The settlement documentation from the preliminary agreements listed the shelter address as part of the claim location. It was in the internal legal files. Internal files, Zaire said. Yes. Which means whoever ordered that fire had access to your internal legal system after the CFO was terminated. His access was revoked. His access was revoked. But access doesn't disappear when one person loses it if that person already passed it to someone else. Zaire stood up. He moved to the window by sound and feel. Your CFO was not the top of this. He was the middle. Someone positioned him there and paid him to do specific things and planned for his removal in advance. The offshore account, that wasn't escape money. That was a payment he'd already received. He was done before you fired him. The line was quiet. This was the shape of it that had been missing. The CFO had been a tool, well-placed, well-compensated, and entirely expendable. The entity that had deployed him still had reach inside the DRI organization, or inside organizations close enough to it to matter. The fire wasn't desperation. It was cleanup. Careful, targeted cleanup by people who had planned multiple steps ahead and were now in the process of removing the remaining physical evidence before the external auditors arrived. And they were framing it. Every piece of it, the recall failure, the formula deaths, the shelter fire, was being arranged so that the forensic trail, when investigators finally followed it, would lead to the DRI name. Rashid had been building a picture for 2 weeks. A private investment group called the Vane Group, Northeastern Operation, Private Consortium, Significant Resources, and a grievance. They had bid on the Hendricks Logistics acquisition 8 months earlier. They had lost by a margin so small it had triggered a formal dispute proceeding that ultimately went nowhere but left a residue of documented animosity. Their CFO connection. The man had worked for a Vane affiliate firm for 4 years before joining the DRI operation. His termination from the affiliate had been quiet, the kind of quiet that meant he had left knowing things and had been positioned inside the DRI structure deliberately. The timeline on every suppressed document, every reclassified file, every delayed recall distribution. It aligned, within days, with periods when a Vane-connected network contractor had active credentials to the DRI internal system. This had been built before the acquisition closed. It had been planted. Selim received the text at 11:17 that night. Unknown number. No area code prefix. 3 words. Stop. Or Tobias. He read it once. He put his phone face down on the desk in front of him and looked at the wall for 4 seconds. Then he picked it up, forwarded the message to Rashid with no accompanying text, put on his jacket, and walked out. He was 3 blocks from Caldwell Street, moving fast, not running. The distinction mattered when he called Zair's number. It rang twice. "Don't go outside tonight," Selim said. "Lock your door. Don't open it until you hear my voice." "Why?" "There's been." Selim, his name, said once, flat and clear in the way of someone who had already decided they were owed the full sentence. "Someone sent me a threat tonight. It had your son's name in it." The line went silent. Not the silence of shock. The silence of someone reorganizing information extremely fast. "Zair, tell me you're inside." A pause. Then, in a voice so careful and controlled it was almost calm, "I'm already outside." The parking garage on Whitmore Street had 42 levels, low clearance on the bottom deck, and security cameras that had been offline on the east side since September due to a maintenance contract dispute that nobody had resolved because nobody important parked there. Zair knew this because he had noted, over the course of 11 visits to the garage, that no one had ever responded to movement on the east wall after 10 p.m., and a working camera would have flagged that. He knew the ceiling height by the change in echo when he walked beneath the support beams. He knew the layout of the lower deck well enough to name every column by position. He was 14 steps from his car when he heard the footsteps. Not behind him, beside him, parallel. Matching his pace with the practiced, deliberate rhythm of someone who had timed their approach, who had been watching from a fixed position and had chosen this moment, this distance, this particular stretch of the deck where the acoustics were worst for carrying sound up to the street. Zair stopped. The footsteps stopped. The garage held a particular quality of silence in that moment. Concrete and cold metal and the faint smell of engine oil and the movement of air from the north stairwell, slow and even, pushing from left to right across the lower deck. And underneath all of it, a sound, small, metallic, familiar to anyone who has ever been in a room where a decision was being made about them. A gun safety releasing. Zair did not run. Running in a space he knew was not the move. Running was for people who navigated by sight, who needed distance to be safe. He had other tools. He dropped his weight low and drove right in the same motion, toward the support column he had already mapped. The one 11 feet to his right, solid poured concrete, positioned between him and the source of the sound. He moved along the floor fast and quiet and pressed his back to the column before the first shot came. The shot hit the wall 4 feet above the place where his head had been. The sound was compressed. Suppressed barrel, the pop thud of a round hitting concrete. He calculated the angle by the impact echo. The shooter was at the 2 o'clock position from his original location. Standing, not crouching. Right-handed dominant. Slight heel drag on the right foot. He had heard it in the approach. He had the geometry. Selim came through the north stairwell at a run. He had been 30 seconds behind Zaire since the call ended on Caldwell Street, which was 30 seconds longer than he should have been, and he had known it with every step of the 3 blocks between them. He came around the base of the stairwell at full speed, cleared the corner, and read the situation in the half-second before the second shot. He stepped into its path. The round hit his left shoulder at the outer edge. Not center mass, not an artery, but enough. The impact rotated him. He went down on one knee, his right hand catching the ground, and he stayed there, not from pain, from the trained instinct to not give a shooter a full target by going flat. The attacker recalculated. He turned toward Zaire's column. That was the mistake. Zaire had spent the elapsed time since the first shot finishing the geometry. He had the attacker's position, weight distribution, dominant side, and movement pattern mapped by sound. When the man's footsteps turned toward the column, Zaire stepped out. Left hand caught the gun arm at the wrist, below the weapon, inside the swing. Right elbow connected with the jaw. One motion, 2 parts. No hesitation. The gun came loose. Zaire tracked it by the sound of its skid across the concrete. His hand closed around it before it stopped moving. He stood up. He pointed the weapon at the sound of the attacker's breathing. The garage was completely silent except for that breathing and the distant hum of the ventilation system and, somewhere above them, the sound of Damon's phone call connecting. Zaire's hand did not shake. Not a tremor. Not a degree of movement. The gun was held in a grip so steady it was almost architectural. The stillness of someone who had learned to function inside conditions of absolute uncertainty and had simply decided that this was another one of those conditions. The attacker did not move. From the floor, Selim said, "Zaire," just his name. Zaire lowered the weapon. The attacker was zip-tied to the column 6 minutes later. Rashid had arrived with the materials, which was either preparedness or a comment on how often they dealt with situations that required it. Damon arrived 4 minutes after that, looked at the man on the floor, looked at his brother on the ground pressing his jacket against his shoulder, and made 2 decisions in approximately 1 second. "Private doctor," Selim said before Damon could speak. "You need a surgical facility. Whitmore has one. Call him." "Selim." "Damon." His voice was flat. "If this goes to a public ER, it goes into a report, and the report goes to the board, and the board uses it. Call Whitmore." Damon called Whitmore. While they waited, Rashid went through the attacker's pockets. Methodically, without rush. He removed a phone, burner, recent purchase, 3 numbers in the contacts, a key card, a building access badge. He read the badge logo twice. Then he showed it to Damon without comment. "Dree Holdings. 3rd floor. Finance division. Active credentials." The attacker was not an outside operative. He had been inside the building. He had used the same hallways and elevators and coffee machines as everyone else. He had been there the whole time. Selim was loaded into the SUV at 1:45 in the morning. He was upright, conscious. His color was not good, but his eyes were clear and his voice, when he spoke, was level enough to be trusted. Zaire stood at the open door of the vehicle. "Go," he said. "You shouldn't be here alone. I have been here alone for longer than you've known where I live." Zaire said it without edge, just as a fact. "Go. Get fixed. Call me when you can talk." Selim looked at him for a moment. Then the door closed. The SUV pulled out. Zaire stood in the garage alone, the attacker zip-tied behind him, and he listened to the taillights disappear up the ramp by the sound of the tires, and then he stood in the quiet and he let himself, for exactly 30 seconds, be still. Then he called Celestine, told her to keep her doors locked, told her not to let anyone into the shelter tonight who wasn't already on the roster. Then he walked to his car. At the private medical facility on Whitmore, at 2:47 in the morning, the monitors connected to Selim Dree's chest flatlined for 3 seconds. 3 seconds. Then caught. The surgical team moved and the machines reset and the numbers stabilized and the situation was managed by people who were paid specifically to manage situations like this. But in the corridor outside, where Zaire had arrived 20 minutes after the SUV, because he had not gone home, had driven there instead, had sat in the parking lot for 12 minutes before walking in. Those 3 seconds passed in a particular kind of silence. He stood against the wall outside the suite door. He didn't move. He pressed the flat of his hand to the wall and he breathed and he waited, and the waiting was the hardest thing he had done since the night he handed his son to a stranger in a doorway and trusted that the stranger would run. Selim survived. That was the first fact, and everything else had to line up behind it. He was in recovery for 11 days. Shoulder repaired. Tissue damage addressed. Blood replaced. His body doing the slow, unglamorous, non-negotiable work of healing that wealth could make comfortable but could not accelerate, which was one of the few things money genuinely could not buy, and which Damon, in a rare moment of unguarded honesty, said made him feel something adjacent to relief. Selim was incapacitated. The board moved on day 3. An emergency restructuring proposal appeared in the corporate secretary's inbox at 6:07 in the morning. Before any of the 3 brothers had been formally notified, before the standard courtesy call that governance procedure required, filed with the kind of aggressive early morning timing that is designed to establish a paper trail suggesting urgency rather than opportunism. The proposal was 17 pages. It cited leadership instability, unresolved regulatory exposure, and the ongoing federal interest in the product liability matter as grounds for a temporary transfer of executive authority to an independent oversight committee. The committee, per the proposal's appendix, would consist of 7 members. 4 of those 7 seats were named. 3 of the named members had documented ties to the Vane Group. The 4th was Theron Haas. 9 years on the DRE board, a man who had attended a private conference in Monaco 8 months earlier and had been photographed at dinner with Aldrich Vane, which was either coincidence or wasn't. They had been building toward this moment. Selim's hospitalization was not bad luck for them. It was the trigger. Zaire learned about the proposal at 7:15 in the morning, when a paralegal named Dominique Adesanya forwarded it from her personal email to a number she had quietly obtained through Rashid's assistant the week before. The subject line was 2 words. They moved. He read the 17 pages on his phone, using the screen reader at maximum speed, in the waiting room outside Selim's recovery suite. He read it twice. Then he sat for a while with his hands folded and Tobias's carrier beside him and the soft sound of the infant breathing steadily in it. Healthy now, growing, making the small exploratory sounds of a baby who had come back from a scare and was taking the world in with fresh attention. Then he called Rashid. "I need access," Zaire said. "To what specifically?" "Board communications. Past 90 days. Internal memos from legal, compliance, and the CFO's office. The original acquisition file. The full version, not the due diligence summary. The CFO's complete sent folder from the 6 weeks prior to his termination. And building access logs for the 3rd floor finance division covering the past 2 months. Rashid was quiet for a moment. "Some of those folders require executive credentials." "I know. Selim can't. He doesn't need to. You can grant temporary read access under your own credentials. The board hasn't moved against you yet. Your access is still current." Another pause. "Give me an hour," Rashid said. The credentials came in 57 minutes. Zaire worked for 4 days. He did it between everything else, between visits to Selim's room, between Tobias's feedings, between Celestine's check-in calls and Dominique's updates on the board timeline and the regular, unannounced calls from a number he didn't recognize that he had stopped answering after the 3rd attempt. He worked on a tablet with a Bluetooth keyboard and a screen reader set to a speed that most people found incomprehensible and that he had been using since he was 19. He built a picture, document by document, timestamp by timestamp. He reconstructed the architecture of what had been done, how it had been hidden, and who had given which instruction to which person at which point in the chain. On the 3rd day, he found the audio file. It was in the CFO's archived sent folder. A folder marked deleted but not purged from the server, the kind of oversight that happens when someone is moving fast and assumes that marking something deleted is the same thing as making it gone. It was a recorded call. 41 minutes and 17 seconds. Between the CFO and a man whose voice Zaire did not recognize until he cross-referenced the vocal pattern against a public earnings call recording he found through the company's investor relations archive. Aldrich Vane, third son of the Vane Group's founding family. The one who ran actual operations while his brothers maintained the public-facing posture of respectability. The one who, in an earnings call 2 years earlier, had spoken for 22 minutes about the importance of ethical acquisition standards. In the recording, he spoke for 41 minutes about how to destroy someone else's ethical standing from the inside. Every piece of it was there. The document reclassification, the suppression list, the offshore account structure, the timeline for the Dree family's reputational exposure, the plan to position them for a distressed sale at a fraction of market value to the Vane Group once the liability became public and unmanageable, the formula, the shelters, the attacker in the garage, all of it spoken plainly by a man who had been certain the call was private. Zaire sat with the recording for a long time after it finished. Then he got dressed. Dark jacket, pressed slacks. His good shoes, the ones he reserved for rooms where people needed to look at him and recalibrate whatever they'd assumed before he walked in. He moved through his apartment with the efficiency of someone who had laid out exactly what he needed the night before. He picked up Selim's coat from the chair beside the hospital bed. It had been sitting there since the night Selim was brought in. Nobody had moved it. Zaire had been aware of it every time he visited. The specific location of it in the room, the sound of the fabric when the air conditioning shifted it slightly. He picked it up. He put it on over his own jacket. The scent was still there. Cedar and iron and that particular steadiness underneath. He wore it out of the building. The Dree Holdings board was convening at 9 in the morning on the 42nd floor. 12 members, full attendance required. Legal team present. Corporate secretary present. The independent committee proposal on the agenda as the first item. They were not expecting a 13th person. Zaire had obtained the room layout from Dominique 2 days prior. Dimensions, table orientation, door position, distance from door to table head. He had walked the layout in his apartment, using furniture as markers, until he could move through it without hesitation. He walked to the head of the table without pausing. He set his phone on the surface. He set a printed document beside it, the priority deprioritization matrix, 3 pages, formatted with the Vane Group's internal document header which Rashid had confirmed through a source who had worked there. "You have 17 pages, Zaire said, explaining why this family should surrender its own company. I have 41 minutes explaining why this board is about to be investigated for conspiracy, coordinated fraud, and the deliberate suppression of a public safety recall that sent infants to emergency rooms." Theron Haas stood up. "This meeting is not open." Zaire pressed play. Aldrich Vane's voice filled the room. Calm, unhurried, specific. The voice of a man who had been comfortable speaking plainly because he had believed no one was listening. The room did not move. By the 4th minute, 2 members had pushed their chairs back from the table. By the 9th minute, one had stepped out to make a phone call and had not come back. By the time the recording ended, 41 minutes and 17 seconds of documented conspiracy played in a conference room on the 42nd floor of a building that bore the name of the family being framed. The room was half empty and Theron Haas was sitting with both hands flat on the table and a stillness that had passed through shock and arrived somewhere quieter and more permanent. Zaire picked up his phone, picked up the document, turned toward the door. At the threshold he stopped. "The restructuring proposal," he said. He did not turn around. "Withdraw it before noon." He left. In the elevator, alone, descending 42 floors, he pressed one hand to the lapel of Selim's coat and he took one breath, deep, uneven, real, and that was the only moment he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. By the time the elevator opened on the ground floor, he had put it away. He walked out into the morning. No one was arrested in a lobby. No one broke down in a corridor and confessed while cameras rolled. There was no single climactic scene with a verdict delivered in a raised voice and an audience watching. That was not how it happened, and it was not how it was ever going to happen, and Zaire, who had never expected otherwise, was the only person in the situation who was not even slightly disappointed by that. What happened instead was a sequence. Quiet, precise, and final. The recording reached the FBI Financial Crimes Unit at 9:47 on a Monday morning. Hand-delivered by Dominique Adesanya, who had spent 3 days organizing the supporting documentation, the reclassified files, the suppression matrix, the offshore transfer records, the building access logs showing the attacker's third-floor credentials, into a package that the receiving agent reviewed for 11 minutes without speaking before looking up and saying, in a voice that was professional and careful, that this was thorough. It was thorough because Zaire had made it thorough. He had spent the better part of 4 days making sure that every piece of evidence was traceable, every timestamp was cross-referenced, every connection was documented in a way that required no interpretive leap. He understood, better than most people who had never needed to prove their own credibility before being believed, that evidence was only as useful as the clarity of its presentation. He had been presenting things clearly to people who didn't want to see them his entire life. This was not different. The Vane Group's board received notice of the federal inquiry by end of business that same Monday. Aldrich Vane's personal and corporate accounts were frozen 48 hours later by court order. His 2 older brothers, the ones who managed the public face of the consortium and who had, over the past 8 months, attended 3 charity galas and signed a letter about ethical investment standards, issued a statement distancing themselves from their youngest brother's activities with the speed and precision of people who had kept that statement ready. The Dree Holdings restructuring proposal was formally withdrawn at 11:43 in the morning, 19 minutes before Zaire's noon deadline. The withdrawal was filed by the corporate secretary on behalf of 3 board members who did not wish to be identified in the motion. Theron Haas submitted his resignation letter by noon. 2 paragraphs. No elaboration. The stock dropped 4 points when the federal inquiry became public. It recovered 6 by the end of the week. By the following Monday, it was trading above its pre-crisis level, because the market, given the full picture, given the documented evidence that what had happened to the Dree family was not negligence or governance failure but deliberate, externally orchestrated sabotage, had reassessed accordingly. Selim watched the press conference from his recovery suite. He was sitting up. The shoulder had been repaired cleanly and the surgeons were satisfied with his progress, though the physical therapist had used the word patience 4 times in their last session in a way that suggested she meant it as a directive rather than a suggestion. The press conference was on a tablet propped against his water pitcher. Rashid was at the podium, measured, precise, reading from a prepared statement about transparency commitments, new compliance infrastructure, and the establishment of an independent third-party oversight board that would hold authority over distribution and recall verification. Standard language. Necessary. The kind of thing a corporation says when it wants to demonstrate that it has understood the lesson. But Selim was not watching Rashid. He was watching the person standing to the right of the podium. Not behind a microphone. Not holding a statement or a title card or anything that would define his role in the institutional sense. Just standing, present, still, in a dark jacket, facing forward. Zaire. Not managed. Not positioned behind anyone else. Not protected by the frame of charity or victimhood or any of the other narratives people had tried to put around him from the moment he walked into that grocery store. Just there. Equal. The nurse who came in to check Selim's vitals found him sitting 3 inches straighter than he had in 11 days. Both eyes on the screen. His expression doing something that she made a note of in her observation log as improved effect, because there wasn't a clinical term for what she was actually looking at. The press conference ended. Questions were fielded. Zaire did not take questions. He had been precise about this in the pre-briefing. He was present as a witness to accountability, not as a corporate representative. He held no title with the company. He had declined every offer of one. What he had was a condition. One condition, written into the restructuring agreement as a non-negotiable clause before he provided the recording to Dominique for delivery. A public transparency mandate requiring independent verification of recall distribution across every zip code in the retail network, confirmed by a third-party auditor, before any recall was considered legally complete. The clause had a name, not his name, the Tobias Mosswood Compliance Standard. Rashid had proposed the name. Quietly, in a conference room, pushing a single sheet of paper across the table toward Zaire without commentary. Zaire had sat with it for a long time. Then he had said yes. He said it quietly, in the way of someone who understood the weight of attaching his son's name to something permanent. Understood that it was both an honor and an exposure, and had decided that if the name was going to mean something in this city, it would mean something that protected the next Tobias before the harm reached him. The FBI announcement came at 4 in the afternoon. By 5, 3 Vane Group board members had retained separate legal representation. By 6, Aldrich Vane had stopped appearing on his own communications. Power does not always end with a scene. Sometimes it ends with an unanswered phone. Months passed the way months do after something enormous. Not quickly, not cleanly, but with the ordinary accumulation of days that don't feel historic until you add them up. Court hearings happened on Tuesday mornings in rooms with fluorescent lighting and wooden benches, and the specific procedural rhythm of a legal system that moves with deliberate, grinding slowness that is either the price of due process or the cost of exhaustion, depending on which side of the table you're sitting on. Zaire sat on neither side. He had no formal role in the criminal proceedings. He had delivered his evidence. He had given a deposition that lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes, and that the prosecuting attorney had described, in a note to her supervisor, as the most meticulously organized individual testimony she had encountered in 11 years of federal cases. He had answered every question fully, and he had not performed anything. Not injury, not anger, not righteousness. Just information organized and delivered without theater. The court did the rest. Aldrich Vane was indicted on 7 counts in early spring. Conspiracy, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, racketeering violations connected to the offshore account structure, willful suppression of a consumer safety recall resulting in documented harm. The kind of charges that do not produce a dramatic moment. No single revelation, no gasping courtroom. Just a reading by a clerk of each count in a flat procedural voice, and then the numbers on a sentencing recommendation, and then a judge's voice setting a date. He received 8 years. He looked at the wall during sentencing. Not at Zaire, who was not in the courtroom. Not at his attorneys, who had done what they could. At the wall, as if the wall were the only neutral surface left in the room. The CFO cooperated with federal investigators beginning in week 2 of his attorney's involvement. His cooperation reduced his exposure significantly. He would serve 26 months. Zaire heard this and said nothing, because what he had to say about it was not something the legal system had asked for and was not something he was interested in spending energy on. The outcome was the outcome. What mattered was what came after it. The settlement fund established through the original civil proceedings was restructured entirely in the months following the criminal indictments. The non-disclosure provisions were removed, every one of them. After Dominique filed a motion challenging their enforceability, given the fraud context. She won. The families from the Marsh Street shelter received full ongoing medical coverage structured as a 15-year trust rather than a one-time payment. Not a check. Not a number with a signature. An actual commitment administered, verified, and subject to annual audit. Celestine was appointed as the community liaison for the trust, which meant she had a seat at the table in every quarterly review and the legal standing to escalate concerns directly to the trust board. She called Zaire when the appointment letter arrived. She cried. Not loud. Just the quiet, releasing kind of crying that comes when you have been holding something in place for so long that the moment it's allowed to come down, your body takes the exhale before your mind catches up. You should have this role, she said. This should be you. I'm not the right person for it, Zaire said. You've been in that building every day. You know those families by name. I know the documents. You saved them. We both did, he said. And then, after a pause, and the next ones that almost happen, that's your job now. Don't let them happen. She didn't argue. The Tobias Mosswood compliance standard passed its first independent audit in April. 47 retail partners verified. Every zip code in the network covered. Third-party confirmation signed and filed. The audit report used the phrase full distribution confirmation 4 times in its executive summary, which was either emphasis or the auditor's way of noting that this was not how things had previously worked. Zaire read the report in his apartment, Tobias on a blanket on the floor beside him. the baby now pulling himself up to standing using anything he could reach and immediately falling back down and seeming unbothered by this, which Zaire found either encouraging or worrying and had not yet decided which. He read the report and then he set his phone down and listened to his son practice falling. He became a paid consultant for the Accessibility Oversight Division of the Corporate Compliance Board. Not symbolic, not ceremonial. A working position. He reviewed proposed protocols, flagged structural gaps, required written responses to every concern he raised, and kept a separate log of every concern that received a response he considered insufficient. The log was not a secret. The board knew it existed. The knowledge of its existence was, he had found, a reasonably effective tool. He took the role on 2 conditions. Flexible scheduling around Tobias's medical follow-up appointments, which were now every 6 weeks and trending toward quarterly. No press. He did not want his name in a press release. He did not want a feature story. He did not want to become the face of anything that would turn what had happened to his son into a narrative someone else could use to make themselves look good. Selim had asked him, once, if that was really what he wanted. The invisibility, the absence from the public record of something he had been so central to. Zaire had thought about it for a moment. The work is what matters, he said. The work continuing after I stop being interesting is what matters. If my name is attached to it, the work becomes about me. I don't want the work to be about me. Selim had not argued. He did not always find it comfortable. There were moments when the board needed the full weight of what Zaire represented, and his choice to remain unnamed made those moments harder to navigate. But he had understood that Zaire's refusal was not modesty. It was a strategy. The work would outlast the news cycle exactly because it wasn't attached to the narrative the news cycle wanted. The rival group watching from the Northeast sent a representative to a Dree Holdings quarterly meeting in late April. He sat through 2 hours of standard agenda items and said almost nothing and left a card on the conference table when the meeting adjourned. Rashid picked up the card. He looked at it for a long time. He put it in his pocket. He did not show it to his brothers. Not that day. On a Thursday evening in early May, Selim sat across from Zaire at the kitchen table in Zaire's apartment. Not a hospital, not a conference room, not a parking structure or a corporate lobby or any of the other spaces they had occupied together over the past 11 months. A kitchen table. With 2 mugs of coffee that had been hot when they were poured and were now room temperature because neither of them had touched them. Tobias was asleep in the next room. The monitor on the counter showed a steady green. Selim sat with his hands folded on the table and he looked at them and then he looked at the wall and then, finally, he said, "If I asked you to leave this city with me." He didn't finish it. He let it sit in the space between them like something fragile he was holding out with both hands and wasn't sure whether the other person would take. Zaire was quiet for a long time. Not the quiet of someone who hadn't heard, or who was stalling, or who was afraid of the question. The quiet of someone who was answering it honestly inside themselves before they let it become words. "Ask me," he said. Selim looked up. "Would you leave with me?" Another silence. Outside, a car passed on the street below. Inside, the monitor beeped once, soft, routine, normal. Tobias adjusted in his sleep, the soft rustle of it audible through the baby monitor's speaker. "I don't know," Zaire said. And he meant it as what it was, not a rejection, not avoidance. Honesty. The specific, careful honesty of a man who had learned that real answers took time and that pretending otherwise was a form of disrespect. Selim sat with that. He nodded once. "Okay," he said. And somehow, in this kitchen, at this table, with cold coffee and a sleeping baby and 11 months of wreckage and reconstruction between them, that was enough. That was enough. 3 months after the sentencing. The pier at the south end of the harbor district was one of those places that existed at the edge of the city's self-awareness, functional enough to still be used, old enough to have accumulated a personality. The planks were salt-weathered and uneven in places, and the railing was cold metal that picked up the chill of the harbor air and held it. The water below moved slowly in the early evening, thick with the gray-green color of deep water at low light, catching the last of the sun in broken, shifting pieces. It looked like something between an ending and a beginning, which was either appropriate or too convenient, and Zaire, who had been told by a social worker 11 months ago that he needed to find meaning in his journey, had decided that meaning was something you made rather than found and that the pier was just a pier. Tobias was in the front-facing carrier on his chest. He was 13 months old now. He had been cleared at his last follow-up. No residual markers from the contamination exposure, developmental milestones on track, lungs clean. The pediatrician had shaken Zaire's hand at the end of that appointment, which was not something she usually did, and had said she was glad to be delivering this particular report. Zaire had said thank you and had held it together until he got to the parking lot. Now Tobias sat in the carrier facing out toward the harbor with the absolute, uncomplicated attention of a child who had not yet learned to filter experience. Taking in the water and the cold air and the sound of the gulls and the smell of the salt and whatever else a 13-month-old receives from the world, which appeared to be everything, all of it at once without hierarchy. Selim stood beside him, not touching, not marking any particular proximity, just present. In the specific way of someone who had made a decision about where they were going to be and was not performing the decision or announcing it, just enacting it. Standing beside someone at a pier in the evening because that was where they had decided to be. They didn't speak for a while. The water moved. A cargo vessel made its slow way across the far end of the harbor, its running lights beginning to appear as the ambient light dropped. Somewhere behind them on the pier, a couple was talking quietly, their voices carrying in the way voices carry over water, clearly, but with the content blurred by distance so you heard the tone without the words. Normal evening sounds. Ordinary. Tobias made a sound. Not distress, not a request, just the small vocal announcement of a baby who is present and engaged and wants the world to know it. His hand reached upward toward nothing in particular, open and grasping, the way babies reach for things they can't quite name. Zaire put his palm on the baby's back. "He's getting heavy," Selim said. "He's been heavy since month 4. Zaire adjusted the carrier slightly. "I got stronger." Selim smiled. Not large, just present. The thing about surviving something like the past 11 months. And it was fair to call it surviving because there had been nights in it when survival was not a metaphor, was that it did not simplify things the way people who had not been through it seemed to assume it would. People wanted the story to end cleanly, wanted the difficulty to have burned off everything complicated and left only the essential. Wanted the lesson to be legible and the future to be clear. It wasn't any of those things. What remained was a more honest version of complicated. Selim was still a Dree. The name still carried the weight of generations of decisions made by people he had not chosen to be descended from but had inherited regardless. He was working on what that meant. Not performing the work in press releases or transparency reports, but actually doing it, which was slower and less visible and sometimes required sitting in board meetings and saying things that nobody in the room wanted to hear and then staying in the room anyway. He was getting better at staying in the room. Zaire was still a man who had built his entire life on the understanding that the world would not accommodate him and that this was the world's limitation and not his, and who had made himself capable and precise and relentlessly informed as a direct result of that understanding. He had not become softer in the past 11 months. He had not unlearned the armor. He had just allowed for the possibility that armor was not the only option. That there were specific people and specific moments where it was possible to put some of it down. Not all of it, some of it. Selectively, he was still deciding. They were both still deciding. That was the honest thing. They were two people who had been through something enormous together and who were now doing the daily, quiet, uncinematic work of figuring out what they wanted the rest to look like. And the rest was not guaranteed. The rest was not promised. The rest was a choice, made again every day, without the drama of crisis to make the choice feel necessary. Just choosing, because they wanted to. The sun finished its descent. The harbor lights came on in sequence. First the fixed markers at the channel entrance, then the running lights of the vessels at dock, then the strings of working lights along the pier itself, amber and steady, turning the gray evening into something warmer. Tobias, seeing the lights, made a sound of significant interest. Zaire turned his face toward the harbor. The water moved. A seabird landed on the railing 12 feet down, regarded them briefly, and left. And then Selim's posture changed. Not dramatically. not with any sound or statement. Just a slight stillness, the kind that is different from ordinary stillness because it has a specific target, a specific input, something that the body has received before the mind has fully processed. Zaire noticed it. He noticed most things. "What?" he said. Selim didn't answer immediately. He was looking across the harbor toward the East Channel, the deep water entrance where larger vessels came in, the part of the harbor that was used for commercial freight and long-haul maritime shipments. A ship was coming in from the east. Large, dark-hulled, moving at a speed that was not quite right for an inbound vessel. Slightly faster than standard approach, which was either a minor deviation or an intentional one. Its running lights were off, which was either a malfunction or a choice, and in Selim's experience, things that could be either a malfunction or a choice were almost never malfunctions. He knew the insignia on the hull. He had to look twice at the distance to be certain. But he was certain. He had seen that insignia in a file, a photograph taken outside a meeting that had not been on any calendar. A photograph that Rashid had received 2 weeks ago from a source he had not fully disclosed to either brother. The card that Rashid had pocketed after the April board meeting. The group from the northeast. The ones who had been watching. Selim said nothing. Tobias reached upward again. The same gesture, open hand, grasping at the lights or the air or whatever a 13-month-old reaches for when the world is wide and available and full of things that don't yet have names. Zaire kept his hand on the baby's back. He felt Selim's stillness beside him. He understood, without being told, that something had shifted, that the quiet of the past 3 months was not the end of anything, but an interval, that the ship coming in across the harbor was not a random arrival. He did not ask Selim to explain it. Not here, not on this pier, in this light, with Tobias awake and reaching and the harbor moving the way it always moved, regardless of what docked at its edges. There would be time to ask later. There would be time to prepare. For now, they stood together on the pier and watched the ship dock. Slow, deliberate, settled. And the question of what it carried, who had sent it, what it meant for everything they had built through the rubble of the past year, sat between them in the salt air. Unanswered, not ignored, just not yet. Love doesn't erase power. It reshapes it. And what gets reshaped next? That is a different story. But it is coming. If the story stayed with you tonight, if Zaire's strength moved you, if Tobias's fight meant something, if this is the kind of storytelling you want more of, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss what comes next. Every story on this channel is built to stay with you long after the audio ends. Drop a comment below and tell us which moment hit you hardest. Was it aisle 7? The hospital corridor? The boardroom? The pier? Let us know. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. You just might be the one who gets it to them.